We were just a bunch of nerdy kids who ignored the haters. We took their ridicule and we built on it. And when some of us gave up, well, we built on that too. Built resilience, built on a mission to make things a little better every day until the users came. Then the haters were VCs who scoffed at our audacity. This just isn't the way things are done. But we kept building. Users turned into teams, turned into companies, running their entire businesses on our apps. Then the software giants came after us. We weren't proven, we weren't fully featured, our radical cloud model wasn't secure. But we built on. And today, as companies adopt the cloud to move faster, teams are finding themselves slowed down by each other's efforts. The skeptics are claiming we'll never develop innovation at scale. But now, DevOps have come to the cloud, ushering in a new era of transformation. Companies can release on demand across hundreds of environments, innovating faster with fewer conflicts and fewer disruptions. There will always be challenges. There will always be naysayers. And we'll build on.
So let's get started here then. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Adam Olshansky. I'm a Salesforce engineer, Salesforce MVP at Google. I have over 600 Trailhead badges, 14 certifications, but I'm really passionate about helping people develop specifically through code on the Salesforce platform, and thrilled to be able to speak with you today. If you want to connect with me afterward, feel free to follow me on Twitter, Adam17AMO, connect with me on LinkedIn, or check out my blog at adamtoarchitect.com. All right, so let's get into why we're here today and kind of why I wanted to really give this talk. So the name of the talk is Lightning Components 101, an Apex Developer's Guide. And so I want to talk briefly about kind of my journey as an Apex developer. And as I've been progressing in my career, I kind of felt like I've been kind of climbing up this mountain, right? And I've been hearing terms here and there that come in, and I've been kind of ignoring them. You know, terms like front end and JavaScript and client side. And these terms come in and I have a vague understanding of what they are, but I've never really dived into them deeply. I'm just kind of happily going along my Apex developer journey. And then I started seeing statistics like this. This was a survey from a website you may be familiar with, Stack Overflow, 2019. They got over 72,000 responses from professional developers. And for the 7th year in a row, they found that JavaScript is the most frequently used language by about 70% of developers. Number 2 was HTML and CSS, which is another kind of front-end language of the web. So JavaScript's pretty popular and has been so for a while. And I also saw these statistics from GitHub. And GitHub shows that since 2013, so again, 7 years, JavaScript is #1 in pull requests. It comprises about 20% of all pull requests are in JavaScript. Python is catching up, but JavaScript's been on top for a while. If you're curious, Apex is currently in 39th place in pull requests on GitHub. All right, so JavaScript's been pretty popular for a while. All these terms have kind of been coming in and out. And one day I kind of looked around and said, you know what? I really don't know anything about this front-end development stuff, and it's a little scary. I'm kind of at the top of this developer journey, this mountain, whatever you want to call it, and I don't really have any sort of safety net. I'm a little bit behind. So what am I going to do about it? And that's kind of why I wanted to get into front-end development, and I figured there were probably other people like me in that same boat as well. So my kind of expectation for today is you're probably an Apex developer, you know a good deal about Apex. I don't want you coming out of here thinking you're going to be able to learn JavaScript in 40 minutes. Not sure you can learn it in 40 hours. But what I do want you to understand is common patterns that you'll see in front-end development on the Salesforce platform that are similar to what you're already doing on the back end. I also want you to gain confidence to be able to start building your own components. I also just want to remind you this is kind of your first step, right? You may have some experience doing front-end development, developing components. You may have no experience. This is kind of step 1. And we're going to talk about steps 2 and 3 towards the end of the talk as well. All right, so in terms of the actual outline, I'm going to start with a brief kind of Apex overview, just talk about some things we already know. We're going to dive into kind of what do we mean when we talk about components. We're going to do a brief visual force versus LWC comparison. do a deep dive into LWC, Lightning Web Components, and then we're going to wrap things up and talk about steps 2 and 3. And when I first wanted to give the talk, I was going to do kind of an outline of Visualforce versus Aura components versus LWC. And all Aura components really are is Lightning Web Components in a wrapper that's making it slower. So if you haven't already started developing components at this point, skip Aura and go straight to Lightning Web Components would be my recommendation, and the recommendation from the PM of Lightning Components. All right, so with that, let's dive into our Apex overview here. All right, so Apex, probably pretty familiar with it. There's kind of two different flavors of it, right? We have triggers and then we have classes. And your triggers are responding to some sort of database event, right? Before insert, after update, some database event happens, our code fires. It's a pattern we're familiar with. Our classes we're kind of familiar with also, right? We have methods, we have parameters, we have return values. That's all in a class. And then variables are kind of interspersed between our triggers and our classes. Right, nothing too crazy there. You're also probably familiar with asynchronous Apex. You're familiar with annotating methods with things like @future. You're familiar with doing things asynchronously, batchable and queuable when resources are available. Right, it's a pretty common pattern in front-end development as well. You're also probably familiar with this Visualforce model view controller model, right? You use HTML style tags like Apex page, Apex data table, Apex page block, right? You have all these tags on your page. And you're probably familiar with bind variables and bind methods, right? You reference a variable in your Visualforce page, you reference a method in your Visualforce page, and you define it in your Apex class. And then of course, MVC, model view controller, you're familiar with your backend kind of database schema, your view, your Visualforce, and then your controller, your logic happening on the Apex side. That's a Visualforce we've worked with before. MVC model we're relatively familiar with. We're also kind of familiar with some of the, we'll say, gaps with the Apex and Visualforce model, right? You're running into governor limits. Everything's button click based. For anything to happen, you have to be clicking buttons. And ultimately, we have to deal with things like the view state and poor performance. And when we're dealing with Visualforce, we keep having to make calls to the Salesforce servers all the time. And sometimes we just end up in situations like this car here, right? We find a random script on maybe Stack Exchange, maybe GitHub, somewhere. We find a JavaScript script. We put in a script tag on our Visualforce page. We copy and paste the JavaScript. We don't know what it does, but it seems to make things work. So kind of like this car, we patch it up and say, it's not perfect, but it works. It's good enough. Kind of a hacky solution, but it works well enough, so we accept it and then we move on. Not necessarily ideal, best practice though. All right, so what can we do about that? I'm going to talk about kind of this new programming model we're entering with front end. I like to call it MVC++. You might also referred to as MVCC. We'll talk about why that is in a little bit. All right, so before we talk about the model itself, I kind of want to talk about Salesforce's developer journey, if you will. So obviously Salesforce was founded in 1999, and kind of in the dot-com boom. The web was really coming into its own. People wanted UIs. They were very button click based. And so Dreamforce 2007, Salesforce launched Visualforce, kind of a UI you can build custom on Salesforce, and everything was great. But as things progressed, this button click based UI started looking a little old. And as we've seen, JavaScript and front-end development have been on top since 2013. And so Salesforce wanted to respond to that. People, consumers, users wanted this kind of, not so much button click based UIs anymore, but kind of responsive UIs, right? When I drag a slider, I want things to update. When I type in a value, my page should auto filter based on the value I typed in, right? It was very JavaScript heavy. And so Salesforce adopted this open source Aura framework and allowed you to develop Aura components and do some front-end development on the platform as well. And that was 2015. And we'll see why a little bit later in the session, but that was okay for a little while, but eventually Salesforce said, you know what, we really need to embrace this JavaScript thing. We need to embrace these standards. We're gonna come out with an even newer programming model that is going to be able to stay longer term and is going to be more standardized with the rest of the web. And so January 2019, they came out with the Lightning Web Component Framework. Right, all kind of based on customer expectations for what a UI should be. Right, so where we were in our Visualforce backend world, our kind of environment looked something like this. We had our client, our user's computer. They'd make a call out to the server, which in our case was Salesforce. We make a call out to Salesforce from our computer. Our Visualforce page loads, it calls our Apex class calls our database, our schema, objects, and fields. All of that happens, loads our Visualforce page, and then it all gets sent back to the computer. And so within that, there are obviously some performance issues that came about with that. Every time you do anything, you click a button, you load something else, you update something, you have to make a call to Salesforce. Salesforce has to make a call back to you every single time. And that can be a little bit cumbersome. And users have been wanting things to be more responsive and don't want to have to wait for a server to have to call and respond every single time. And so this is kind of where we're moving to now. We still have our Salesforce org. We still have our objects and fields, our database on the org. That's not going anywhere. We still have our Apex in Salesforce. That's not going anywhere. Our M and C parts of MVC, if you will. But we're going to move some stuff from the server over the client side, namely the view, right? So the entire view is now moving over to the client side. So I don't have to wait to call Salesforce to load my view every time. I'm going to have it load right in my browser. And to make things even more responsive, what's the point of having the view in my browser if I still have to call Apex and Salesforce every time? So I'm going to add a second controller, a JavaScript controller, namely, in my browser also. So now I have my UI in my browser, I have a controller in my browser, and then if I need it, I still have Apex on Salesforce and I still have my database on Salesforce. But a lot of stuff is being moved from our Salesforce server to the browser, so I don't have to wait to make that server call each and every time I'm doing everything. All right, so with this MVCC model, if you will, we hear about these things called components. And what do we mean when we say a Lightning component? And all a Lightning component really is it's a collection of files. It's a bundle of files, as it's referred to. And just like in Apex, there are kind of two different flavors of components. We have Aura components and we have Lightning Web components. And both of these are going to have, we focus on this right side here, they're both going to have some sort of UI file. They're both going to have some sort of controller file. They're both going to have some CSS. Aura is going to have some other files that are built in. Lightning Web Components are going to have an XML file. If you've worked in Visual Studio or Eclipse, you've probably seen the XML file that's kind of behind the scenes. And all your Apex classes and Visualforce pages, but you usually kind of ignore. Still going to be there for components. We're just not going to ignore it as much anymore. But essentially, all we mean when we say a bundle is that all these files know about each other. So I don't have to tell my Visualforce page what Apex class to use, because my component UI is automatically going to know the component controller that goes along with it. And it's automatically going to know about the component CSS that goes along with it. So all these files are just bundled together, and we call that collection of files a Lightning component. All right, so let's talk quickly about kind of what's not changing with components, stuff we really already know all about. The first one is that we're going to be using UI components. We're also going to be using event-based code, like we've seen in triggers. Bind variables and bind methods, that's not going anywhere. And we're already kind of used to multiple files being used. And I'm going to walk through kind of examples of each one of these and show you what I mean here. So when we talk about UI components, right, we're familiar with this in Visualforce. We have these Apex tags, right? I'm familiar with Apex page block. That's all happening in Visualforce. We're used to using tags in our UI. And that's not changing at all. The tags are just going to get new names. So because they're Lightning components, we're going to get Lightning tags. Right? We're going to get, instead of Apex input, we're going to get Lightning input. And then because Salesforce is trying to embrace standards of the web, we're also going to get some standard HTML tags. So no longer am I going to have to Google this tag Visualforce, this tag Salesforce. I can just Google the tag name, and I'm going to get information about it, which is kind of cool. And we're also going to get these tags starting with the letter C. C is just kind of the Salesforce default namespace. So if you work on an App Exchange package, you might already have a namespace in your org. If not, your default namespace is going to be C, and that's how we're going to be able to refer to other components in our org. Event-based code we're familiar with, right? Again, triggers fire on events all the time. Before insert, after update, database events fire, our code fires. And we're doing the same thing with front-end development, but the only difference is, remember, now we have that controller on the client side. And we're going to want to be able to respond to those events. We want to be able to respond to the client-side events. When a user clicks something on the page, we want some code to run. When the user changes a value on a page, we want some code to run. And so now we're going to be responding to browser events. Same pattern though, some event happens and we fire off some code. So these events are going to have names like on change or on click, right? When a user clicks something, when a user changes a value, and we'll see an example of that in a few minutes also. But it's a pattern we're already pretty familiar with. Bind variables, that's not changing at all, right? We reference a variable in our view and it refers to a variable in our controller. And it's the same thing here. The syntax has changed slightly. We took out the exclamation point, but otherwise it's the same thing. We reference a variable in our UI, the variable is defined in our controller. And the methods, the same thing, right? We have these methods that we can reference in the UI. And again, we're going to reference those methods, define those methods in our controller. The only difference is now we have two controllers, remember. So when we're in our client-side HTML UI, we're going to be able to reference methods in our client-side JavaScript controller. When we're in our client-side JavaScript controller, we're going to also need to be able to reference methods in our server-side Apex controller. And so we're going to be able to define what we want to call those method names. We can bring them in like variables. And we'll see an example of that in a little bit also. But on the front end, referring to method names, again, similar syntax. We take out the exclamation point, but it looks the same otherwise. And lastly, this concept of using multiple files. So I talked about when we're talking about a Lightning component, right? We have all these files that go into this bundle. But we're actually pretty used to that already, right? We already have a Visual Force page and an Apex controller and an Apex helper maybe. We already have a bunch of files working together. We just have to tell all the files about each other. We just don't have to do that anymore with our component bundle. But the same thing, we're dealing with multiple files. We have a file for the UI or HTML file. We have a file for our client-side controller in JavaScript, and we have a file for our server-side controller, our Apex controller. So we still have multiple files. Some of them just already intrinsically know about each other. All right, so let's do a little demo here of Visual Force versus Lightning components, and then let's take a look at the code to see what's happening behind the scenes. So if I can find my mouse here, all right. So here we have a page. And I have two components here. I have my Visual Force component up here, and I have my Lightning Web component down here. And so my Visual Force component, I have, it says hello VF, and I have a text box, and I have a button. So I can type in hello virtual Dreamin. And if I click update, it takes a second, but I see hello virtual Dreamin show up here as well. All right, it works fine. Let's come down here to my Lightning Web component. It already says hello world. And as I'm typing hello virtual Dreamin, it automatically shows up above here. I didn't have to click any buttons. It was responding to as I was typing. The text is automatically updating. It's pretty cool, I think. Let's go take a look at how exactly that's happening. All right, so let's start with our Visual Force page. There's nothing really crazy going on there. We have an Apex page tag. We tell it we're using a Hello World controller or Apex controller. And then we have some other tags, but ultimately it comes down to an output text tag that says hello with our greeting variable, and then an input tag that's referring to, again, our greeting bind variable. And whenever we click that Apex command button on the top, we want to re-render our output value. So we have to tell it, hey, when you click this button, that's what I want you to re-render and update what the output text is showing. Right, if I look at the controller there's nothing really in the controller, just a getter and setter for my bind variable. Let's go take a look at our Lightning Web component, what's happening there, though. So again, I see some tags here. And again, instead of Apex form, I have a tag like Lightning card. Instead of an Apex output text tag, I have a standard HTML paragraph tag, P. And again, that paragraph tag is just saying hello, greeting, where greeting is a bind variable, same sort of thing. Again, instead of an Apex input tag, I have a Lightning input tag, same sort of thing there. And again, I'm defining the value as greeting. The other thing I have in my Lightning input tag is that browser-based event we talked about earlier, on change. So whatever I'm typing in changes, whenever that input value changes, I want to fire off some code, namely a method called handle change. And again, this is using the bind method syntax we're familiar with from Visualforce. But this is the entire UI for that Lightning Web Component. It uses some standard HTML tags, the output tag, a paragraph, and a Salesforce Lightning input tag. And if I look at the controller here, right, remember we have a greeting variable and we have a handle change method. This is what my controller looks like for my Lightning Web Component. And the first thing I'm going to see is that I'm importing from the Lightning Web Component namespace. If you've developed in Java before, you're probably familiar with importing different libraries. Same sort of thing here, we're just importing different libraries. So all of our Lightning Web Components, we need to import the Lightning element from LWC. And we're also importing something else that we'll talk about in a second, the word track. The next thing we see, we're just going to export our code here. And so again, our component is named, maybe it's named HelloWC. I thought it was named Hello World, but Hello LWC. It's going to extend Lightning element. And just like we have all of our Visualforce, all of our Apex classes start off with, you know, public or private, whatever class, and the class name, all your Lightning Web Components are going to start the same way as well. So if you forget how to do it, you can always Google it. It's going to import Lightning element from LWC, and then you're going to export your class name by extending Lightning element. Then the next thing here in line 4 we see is that @track. And so we're familiar with annotating things like @future in our Apex controllers already. This annotation in Lightning Web Components has a specific name, and they're called decorators. And there's 3 of them we're going to talk about today. This is the first one, @track. And @track is going to give this variable some kind of special properties. Number 1, it's going to make it a private attribute. And number 2, it's going to tell it to automatically re-render on the UI whenever it changes. So if you remember in Visualforce, we had to tell our command button to re-render our output text. By putting @track on the greeting variable, it's going to know whenever it changes, it needs to re-render itself on the UI. And I think with Summer 21, Salesforce is making all variables @tracked by default, so we may not need to explicitly set @track anymore. But if you do see it showing up, that's what it does. So our greeting variable is being tracked, and it has a default value of world. So that's why it said hello world at the beginning. And then down here in line 6, we have our handle change method. And all of our handle change method is doing is it's taking in the event. So just like our triggers take in trigger.new or trigger.isInsert, right? It takes in the event. Salesforce, our Lightning Web Component, is taking in the event that fired this method. And all we're doing is line 7 is setting the value of the greeting variable to be the value that was updated as part of this event. So whenever I typed input block, fired the event, that value then gets assigned to greeting. Greeting is @track, so it automatically re-renders in the UI. All right, so what did we just see here? We saw component markup. We're familiar with that, right? Lightning input instead of Apex input. We saw code running based on events. Again, we've seen this before as well with triggers. We saw variable and method bindings, our greeting variable and our handle change method. We also saw that our controller was part of our component bundle. We didn't have to tell our Hello World UI to talk to our Hello World controller. And the last thing we saw here is no Apex. So that Lightning Web Component I built, it's all happening in the browser. I don't have to wait for a button click to call Salesforce and then send it back to me. As I'm typing it in, the browser is automatically updating it for me. And so that's going to give me a nice performance boost. All right, so let's do a deep dive now into Lightning Web Components. And before we do that, let's talk briefly about kind of why Salesforce made this change. Remember, we talked about Salesforce's developer journey. They just came out with Aura in 2015. Why did they come out with Lightning Web Components just a couple of years later? And it kind of has to do with how development on the web has been happening in general. So we saw JavaScript really started taking off in 2013. In 2014, when the Aura framework was really being developed, the web looked something like this. And don't worry as much about all the words in the boxes, but I want you to focus more on the scale between the green and the orange. So the green represents the frameworks themselves. So JavaScript frameworks, there are a ton of them out there. You may have heard of Angular, React, things like that. And the frameworks were pretty heavy back in 2014. They had to do a lot of heavy lifting. That orange part, the browsers, were relatively lightweight. They had the JavaScript kind of framework built in, some event handling built in, and not much else. But if you fast forward to 2019, that balance has really shifted. And the web is actually very, very strong in what it can do, and frameworks are being a lot more lightweight, right? So now, instead of the frameworks having to do everything like Aura, the web is actually able to handle a lot of that for us. And so Salesforce decided to respond to that. And so that's kind of where the Lightning Web Component model came about. And so Salesforce wanted to take advantage of a lot of that web standard functionality and really embrace standards across the web to make it easier not only for Salesforce developers to do other web development off platform, but to bring in other non-Salesforce developers onto the platform. And so we see on the right side here, the Lightning Web Component model takes advantage of all this orange, a lot of the web standardization. And Salesforce has some stuff built on top, the base components we saw, like the Lightning Input. They have the Lightning Data Service, which we'll talk about, where Salesforce can update records without needing Apex. And then Salesforce Security, obviously, needs to be built in on top as well. All right, so we talked a little bit about what's old with Lightning Web Components. Obviously, this is a new programming model, and there's also a lot of new stuff with Lightning Web Components. And so let's talk a little bit about that also. The first thing that's new is industry standards. So as I mentioned, Salesforce is really trying to embrace web standards now. So they've joined a lot of standardization boards, and so Salesforce will have an input now in how the web develops, new standards that come out. And as they move forward, when they're building their own framework, they can take advantage of a lot of that standardization. This also, again, as I mentioned, if you're a Salesforce developer and you want to start developing off-platform, you're going to have a lot more kind of industry standard web experience knowledge. And if your friend who's a non-Salesforce web developer maybe wants to think about a career change a little bit, you can tell them to start working with Salesforce, and they're already going to have a head start in doing the modern web development. In terms of the next thing, logic all being in one spot. So we're probably familiar in Visualforce how we can have this notion of, I want to display something on the screen. So I put a bunch of stuff in my curly bracket bang. Maybe I have a variable, maybe I have some text, maybe I have another variable. I just concatenate it all together and it shows up in the UI. That's a pretty clear violation of the MVC framework, right? The controller, the logic is supposed to happen in the controller. And so that's what it's going to be now. All the logic is happening in the controller, it all gets calculated, and the UI is just there to render the calculation. This is one of my favorite things, multiple Apex controllers. So in Visualforce, for the most part, we have to put everything into one Apex controller. There is some opportunity to kind of add extensions and things like that. But with Lightning Web Components, we're also able to add as many controllers as we want. So that's why I like to call the framework MVC++, because there's really not a limit to how many controllers you can have. The other thing are decorators. So we talked about @track. We're going to talk about 2 more decorators in a few minutes here. But these decorators will give your variables special properties that you can then utilize in your UI. All right, so let's get into a deep dive Lightning Web Component demo here. And again, I want to focus on the concepts. I'm going to walk through the code. The session's being recorded. The code will be made available to you afterward. I really want you to focus on the concepts that are happening here. So the first one I want to talk about is a component called create accounts. And so I have this UI here. It says LDS create account. I have an ID input field that is disabled. I have a name field that I can type in. I have a button that says create account. And so if I type in something here like virtual Dreamin, I click create account. I wait a second and I see this nice toast that my account was created. I get an ID back here. I can go take a look at my accounts. And if I go refresh this, I'll see that sure enough, I just created this virtual Dreamin account. I'll see this ID here ending in IAM. I go back here, I see that ID is here as well, IAM. Let's say I want to change this to virtual Dreamin 20. Oh, my ID went away because now it looks like I'm creating a new account. I also have this text down here that I can create a record without writing any server-side code. So we'll see in a second, but this component is actually not using any Apex at all and still able to create records. And then I have this link here that says view source. And if I click it, it takes me over to GitHub where I have this repository ending in LDS create record. We'll see why that's important in a minute here. So this is basically the code to make this component work. All right, so what the heck is happening here? Let's go take a look at the code to make this work. All right, so this is the UI for my component here, and I see a few different things. The first thing I see is a template tag. So just like all my Visualforce pages are going to start with Apex page, all my Lightning Web components are going to start with a template tag. It's just a standard HTML tag. I then go down a little bit farther and I see some Lightning-based components such as Lightning Card, which again, very similar to Apex Form. And then I see some Lightning input tags. So I see an ID tag or a tag with the name of ID that's disabled. I see another input tag for the name. And then I see a Lightning button. Again, we're familiar with tags. We've seen them before in Visualforce. So we see two inputs and a button here. My first input, again, we're responding to browser events. So my first input, I see an onChange tag. Whenever that value of my account changes, I want to fire my handle name change method. And then I'm also going to respond to this onClick event. So when my button is actually clicked, I'm going to respond to this create account event. The other thing I see down here is a new tag, see view source. So remember I mentioned toward the beginning, we can have kind of three types of tags. We can have standard HTML tags. We can have Salesforce tags that usually start with Lightning. And then we can have tags usually starting with the letter C, which in our case is our namespace. And see view source just refers to a Lightning Web component called view source that we have in our org. And so we're going to bring it into this component. We also see we're assigning a value to source. So we talked about in Apex classes, we can send parameters to methods. Same thing with Lightning Web Components. We can send values to parameters in other Lightning Web Components. So here we're going to take our view source component. We're going to assign a value of LDS create record to our source variable. And then we have some text below that also displayed on the screen. Let's go take a look at our view source component real quick. And the component itself is pretty simple. It actually uses all standard HTML tags. So we have our template tag, we have a div, we have a paragraph tag, we have our a tag, which is just a link. And the link that it links to is defined in the href property. So the href property is pointing to a value of source URL. Right, so if I take a look at the controller now, we know we're going to have a source URL that we see here. And we also defined a source parameter coming from our other component. And so let's go take a look at how both of those parameters are defined. So this is our controller for our view source component. Again, we import Lightning element. We also see we have a base URL on GitHub. And then we see that source variable we talked about before with our second decorator on it at API. So if you remember, @track makes a variable private, automatically re-renders on the UI. @API is going to make the variable public and automatically re-render on the UI. So because this variable is public, just like in Apex, we're able to pass a value to it. So our source is getting some value of, I think, LWC/LDS create record. And so now down here in our get source URL, we're able to take our GitHub repository base, add the source to it, concatenate those together to get our source URL. We have a getter just like we would in Apex. And now our source URL is what gets rendered in our view source UI. So again, all of this logic is happening in our controller and the UI is just rendering it. So that's how our source URL gets calculated from a value we passed in. And so we can utilize this component across all of our other components, just passing in a different source value every time. And it's going to be able to link back to that same GitHub repository. Now, let's jump back to our create record component now. Remember, we talked about we had an input with a handle name change method on change, and we had a button with a create account method on click. Let's go take a look at those methods now. This is the first part of our controller, and we see we're importing quite a bit actually now. And I think everything's okay. So we're importing quite a bit here now. You see we're importing from LWC. We are importing our show toast event. So that toast that came up when I said success, we're importing from there as well. Timeout, yes. 5.
So just a quick reminder, you have a 5-minute left, sorry.
Oh, really? Okay. I will keep that in mind. All right, thanks, Amit. All right, so we see we're importing our show toast event. So that's what came up when we said, when our success message came up. So we're importing some things from the Salesforce Lightning libraries. So we can import from there. We can import another custom component, LDS utils. And then we can also import from our database schema as well. So in our case, we're going to import our account object, and we're going to import the name field from our account object. Again, we see our account ID is being @track. So whenever the account ID changes, it's going to re-render. We then see our handle name change event here. So when our account ID, whenever our name changes, our account ID is going to be reset. So that's why it zeroes out when I change the name. And we see our name is changing whenever we type in something new to that box. If I come lower down in our component, we see our onClick method, create account. And again, remember we imported the account object and the name field up above. We also imported something called create record from the UI record API. And then we're going to just basically put all those into parameters here, our name field, our account object. We're going to call create record. And this is actually how we're creating a record without needing any Apex. So this is a standard library you can import called from the Lightning Data Service that's going to be able to create records without needing any Apex at all. All right, and then one more quick demo I want to show. The component doesn't look as interesting, but the code is here. And this is going to be our wire to Apex method. And so all this component does is it says the word contacts, lists a bunch of contacts in my org, and has the word opportunities and lists a bunch of opportunities in my org. And then again, we have our view source method down here, and we see this is going to another GitHub repository for Apex wire method to property. And to take a look at this code here, this is our UI for this code here. And we see something in here, if true context.data. And so just like in Apex, we can have conditional statements in our web components. And basically, we're just saying if true just means if there's a value there. So we have some variable in our controller called contacts. We have some property on our controller called data. And so if contacts has any data, then we want to have a for loop, just like we would in Apex, similar to Apex repeat and Visualforce. For each value in contacts.data, we're going to display the contact name. If not, we're going to send it to some custom error panel component down here. And then the same thing with opportunities, right? If our opportunities variable has a data property defined, we're going to display our opportunity names and amounts. And if not, again, we're going to send it to some custom error panel. The controller for this is actually pretty simple. We see we're using Apex controllers now, though. So we're going to import from our Apex controller, Apex controller and Apex method called getContactList. We're going to import from a second Apex controller, our opportunity controller. And then we get down to our third decorator, @wire. And so @wire is going to allow us to wire our variables to Apex methods or some other things. And @wire is going to do two things as well. One, it allows us to connect it to some Apex, and then it's going to give it two properties automatically. So because our context variable is wired, it's going to get a data property and an error property. So the data property is going to be whatever is returned from your Apex. So whatever comes back from my getContactList method is going to be defined in context.data, and whatever gets returned from my getOpList method is going to be defined in opportunities.data. But this is the whole controller to make that component happen. And the Apex, again, is pretty simple here. We're just returning a SOQL query. We have the @aura enabled annotation like we would with @future. And then if I take a look at the component UI again, right, our SOC will return some contacts. So context.data has values. We can display our contacts. If not, we'll send it to our error component. And then the same thing with opportunities. Our opportunities.data has a value, so we can display our opportunities. Right, and so here we saw, again, component markup, method and variable bindings, our 3 decorators, @track, @API, and @wire. And we can import from anywhere. We can import from Salesforce libraries. We can import from Apex controllers. We can import from our database schema. We can import from custom components. Pretty much anywhere we want, we can bring it into our components, and that allows us for a lot of opportunities for customization. All right, so quick recap. This was step 1. Where do we go from here for step 2? Right, we know that web development's already pretty popular, and Salesforce has been evolving to meet demands. We've seen some similarities between the front end and the back end, but JavaScript's been on top for a while. And so Lightning Web Components, with the standardization Salesforce is embracing, are really both the present and the future of Salesforce development. And so congratulations on taking step 1 on your journey to front end development. If you're looking for more resources, again, these will be made available to you afterward. Salesforce has a ton of information on the component library, just like in Visualforce. You can look up all the base components. They have a sample gallery with a lot of already made code, like the GitHub repository I showed, where you can kind of take the already made code and start building on top of it. They have a good trail mix and also some resources from the Salesforce instructor that teaches Lightning Web Components. I also quickly want to briefly touch on, in addition to moving forward with front-end development, you're probably going to want to get into the Lightning Design System. The Lightning Design System you can find on lightningdesignsystem.com. This is pretty cool. It has a bunch of kind of pre-made CSS libraries, things like bringing in progress bars, accordions, icons, images, all sorts of things. Lets you bring in automatic borders for your components, padding, margins, allows you to adjust your components, again, provides sample code, and is really useful without you having to learn exactly how CSS works, because CSS can also be a pain. I'm going to put this back up in a second, but all the code I showed you is available at GitHub/Adam17AMO LWC101. And again, thank you all for joining so much, and enjoy the rest of Virtual Dreamin'.